Can you believe that an entire continent, steeped in darkness, disease, and the constant crushing fear of eternal damnation, could suddenly be gripped by a single, terrifying, glorious idea? Not a slow political shift, not a gradual awakening, but a sudden, violent spasm of faith that ripped 100,000 souls from their homes, turning farmers, rapists, knights, and zealots into a single, unstoppable, and absolutely catastrophic tidal wave of vengeance, marching 3,000 miles toward a land they'd only ever heard whispered in dusty scripture. This is the story, the true story of the First Crusade, not as a chapter in a textbook, but as the raw, unfiltered, terrifying hallucination it truly was. Because before 1095, Europe was barely surviving. It was a land of petty tyrants, where a harvest failure meant mass starvation, where the average lifespan was tragically short, and where the constant threat of Viking raids or internal warfare made life cheap and brutal. The Church, the great unifying force, was wrestling with corruption and power struggles, but even they understood the fundamental truth. The people needed a distraction, a purpose grand enough to make them forget the misery of their mud-filled existence. They needed an enemy, a glorious quest, and a prize worth dying for. And the ultimate prize, the holiest piece of real estate on the planet, was tragically, maddeningly, in the wrong hands. We must rewind the clock to the dead heart of the 11th century. Feudalism had fractured the mighty Carolingian Empire into 1,000 warring fragments, each baron eager to seize his neighbor's land, leading to endless, meaningless bloodshed. And they were calling. Far to the east, the great power centers of the Islamic world, primarily the rising Seljuk Turks, were not just holding the Holy Land, they were swallowing the Byzantine Empire whole, the ancient eastern bastion of Christianity. The emperor in Constantinople, Alexios I Komnenos, was terrified. His armies were shattered, his frontiers collapsing, and he knew that soon the walls of the great city would be all that stood between the surging Turkish tide and Western Europe. So, Alexios did the unthinkable. He sent a desperate plea across the Adriatic, a message that was less a request for soldiers and more a Hail Mary pass tossed into the abyss. He wasn't asking for an army to conquer the world. He was begging for a few hundred mercenaries, highly skilled knights who could help stabilize his collapsing borders. But Pope Urban II, a man of ruthless political genius and towering ambition, read that desperate scroll not as a request for help, but as a divine invitation to rewrite history and claim absolute spiritual dominance. Urban II saw an opportunity to heal the great schism between the Western and Eastern churches, to exert papal authority over kings and emperors, and most importantly, to redirect the endemic violence of the European nobility away from each other and toward a glorious outside enemy. He called for a council in Clermont, France, in the freezing cold of November 1095, promising that he had a message directly from the throne of God. And when the people gathered, shivering in the massive fields outside the city walls, Urban II delivered the ultimate psychological weapon, a sermon that remains one of the most effective pieces of mass manipulation ever recorded. Every word was designed to ignite the deepest, most primal fear of every medieval man, that their faith was under attack, and that they, personally, would be condemned to hell for standing idly by. And then came the promise, the ultimate devil's bargain. Whoever undertook this pilgrimage, this armed march to reclaim Jerusalem, would receive an immediate and total remission of all sins. Imagine that. A lifetime of theft, murder, rape, and avarice, gone, instantly redeemed by simply taking the cross. It was the ultimate get-out-of-hell-free card, offered to a population drowning in guilt and terror. The response was deafening, a primal roar of assent that echoed across the centuries. The crowd shouted, "Deus vult," God wills it. This wasn't just a war effort. It was a societal explosion. It wasn't organized, it wasn't planned, and it was certainly not calm. It was the moment Europe collectively lost its mind and set its sights on the ultimate glorious prize, the city of God itself, held captive by the infidel. The stage was set for a 4-year odyssey of staggering violence, unimaginable starvation, heroic endurance, and betrayal so deep it would make the most hardened modern cynic gasp in horror. But before the armored knights could even sharpen their swords, the first terrifying wave of untrained fanatics was already moving, rushing headlong into disaster, proving immediately that the road to heaven was paved with the mangled bodies of the desperate poor. The true slaughter was about to begin, and it started not with the kings, but with a terrifying, charismatic figure known only as Peter the Hermit, leading the desperate masses into inevitable oblivion. The world had barely digested the Pope's terrifying decree when the first disastrous wave broke upon Europe. The true, terrifying echo came not from the castles of mighty dukes, but from a man so humble, so ragged, he looked like death walking, Peter the Hermit. This figure of absolute mania, riding not a war horse, but a donkey, yet wielding the spiritual power of 1,000 kings, galvanized the desperate masses. He wasn't leading knights, he was leading the lost, the starving, the deeply indebted, and the fanatical fringe, a terrifying, disorganized tidal wave of human desperation, given the ultimate religious mandate to march east and reclaim the Holy Land. They numbered perhaps 60,000 to 100,000 souls, carrying farming tools instead of swords and belief instead of supplies. They had no logistics, no maps, only the burning, apocalyptic conviction that God would pave the way with immediate, glorious miracles. They split into two main, reckless groups. One was under the direct, charismatic, if utterly incompetent, command of Peter himself. The other was led by the fiercely practical, though equally unprepared, minor knight known only as Walter Sans Avoir, Walter the Penniless, a name that perfectly captured the state of this entire apocalyptic mob that had abandoned everything for the cross. The initial journey across Europe was not a calm pilgrimage, it was a devastating plague. As they moved through the prosperous Christian lands of Hungary and the Balkans, the local populations quickly realized these crusaders were simply desperate, starving bandits clad in the symbol of Christ. They ran out of food within weeks, and when they knocked, begging for sustenance, they were met with bolted doors, fortified walls, and hostile local militias. The darkest, most unforgivable stain on this initial wave of holy fervor was the savage, terrifying turn against the ancient Jewish communities of the region. Fueled by lunatic preachers like Count Emich of Leiningen, who joined the People's Crusade late with his own ruthless contingent, the mobs decided that since they were traveling thousands of miles to slaughter the enemies of Christ abroad, why not start with the enemies closer to home? Alexios, a master strategist and pragmatist, knew immediately that this People's Crusade was not an army, but a crippling liability. They were a ticking time bomb of starvation and instability. He offered them vast amounts of food and much-needed supplies, but his ultimate, singular goal was this: get them across the Bosphorus and into Asia Minor as fast as humanly possible, before their presence could destabilize his capital or prematurely invite the concentrated, lethal wrath of his Turkish enemies. The Crusaders, however, refused to be disciplined or strategic. They looted the suburbs of Constantinople with astonishing impunity, viewing the opulent Byzantine Christians with deep suspicion and profound contempt, convinced that these Easterners were merely half-heretics living in sinful luxury rather than pious allies. Peter the Hermit, completely overwhelmed by the sheer unmanageable scale of the mob he had unleashed, lost control completely. They landed near Nicomedia, now deep inside the domain of the powerful Sultan Kilij Aslan I. This was the exact moment the theological dream violently met the harsh reality. And the reality was devastatingly simple: a professional, tactical cavalry charge. Immediately, the utter lack of discipline that plagued their march was exploited by the seasoned Turks. Instead of consolidating their position and establishing supply lines, the groups splintered instantly, obsessed only with foolishly raiding the nearby Muslim villages for meager supplies. On the fateful day of October 21, 1096, the superior Turkish forces descended with cold, brutal precision. Peter the Hermit, having wisely, or cowardly, depending on your view, gone back to Constantinople to beg Alexios for more supplies and food, was nowhere near the ensuing carnage. The bulk of the People's Crusade, armed with pathetic farm implements and sheer desperate faith,
marched straight into the planned ambush.
It was not a battle. It was the ultimate, swift massacre. Turkish archers, mounted on their swift, mobile horses, systematically peppered the dense, disorganized Christian ranks until they collapsed into a panicked mess. Thousands were slaughtered instantly in the opening volleys. Those few who tried to flee were immediately cut down by the superior Seljuk cavalry, which showed no mercy to the ragged invaders.
This was not Peter the Hermit's fever dream mob. This was the hammer of God, wielded by Europe's most ambitious, land-hungry, and fanatical warlords. Imagine the sheer, terrifying noise as the greatest military mobilization since the fall of Rome began its slow, inevitable grind toward the east. A relentless machine of vengeance and greed finally stirring to life. This was not a single, unified army, but a tidal wave of feudal ambition, split into 4 colossal, independently commanded columns, each vying for eternal glory, eternal salvation, and, most crucially, earthly spoils. Their names echoed with a sinister gravity, soon to be whispered in terror across the deserts of Anatolia. But the true muscle, the tactical genius, and the frightening cold-blooded intent came from 2 other directions. Raymond IV of Toulouse, the richest man in the entire expedition, an old, grizzled veteran whose piety was as intense as his thirst for power, leading the massive contingent of Provençals and southern French knights. He was a force unto himself, a man who saw the Holy War not just as a mission, but as the final, necessary act of his long, violent life. And then there was Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman mercenary, a man whose ambition was so palpable it stank of sulfur and cold iron. The master of siege warfare, the tactical genius of the Mediterranean. He brought with him his nephew, Tancred, a young prodigy of violence, ready to carve out a kingdom from the ruins of the Byzantine Empire itself, not just the Levant. Moving these 4 separate, often mutually hostile armies, totaling perhaps 60,000 to 70,000 souls, including knights, foot soldiers, squires, camp followers, and essential livestock, was a logistical nightmare that defied the very laws of the medieval world. Roads dissolved into mud beneath the crushing weight of thousands of iron shoes. Rivers turned crimson with the strain of crossing, and the supply lines stretched until they snapped, often leading to immediate and brutal violence against the very Christian populations they were supposedly protecting. The inevitable collision course was set for Constantinople, the gilded, ancient capital of the Byzantine world, ruled by the shrewd, paranoid emperor Alexios I Komnenos. Alexios had asked for a handful of mercenaries to secure his border. He received a continent-sized invasion force led by men who openly despised his Eastern Orthodoxy and openly coveted his vast wealth. As the first contingent, led by Hugh of Vermandois, arrived, Alexios immediately implemented his terrifying strategy: control through isolation. He detained Hugh, treating him as a high-value hostage noble, sending an unmistakable message to the other approaching princes. You are not conquerors here. you are guests, and I hold the lease to your journey. The atmosphere in Constantinople became toxic, a cauldron of mutual suspicion and barely contained hostility. The Western knights, barbaric and illiterate in the eyes of the refined, silk-clad Byzantines, were awestruck by the city's unimaginable wealth. The towering walls, the golden domes, the sheer scale of the civilization that had survived 1,000 years of darkness. They wanted it. They wanted all of it.
Aleosios, realizing that these Franks were not allies, but wolves in the sheepfold of God, knew he had to disarm them politically before they could disarm him militarily. His objective was singular: get them across the Bosphorus as quickly as possible, sworn to an oath that would protect his territorial claims in Anatolia. Bohemond of Taranto was the first to realize the game. A master negotiator, he looked at Alexios not as an emperor, but as a rival warlord, and he began to play the Byzantine system against itself. He demanded titles, wealth, and command, using his military reputation as deadly leverage. Godfrey of Bouillon resisted violently, leading to terrifying standoffs and skirmishes outside the city walls, where the Frankish greed nearly boiled over into open war against their hosts. But the sheer logistical dependency on Alexios for food, guides, and ships forced him to bend the knee and accept the gold. It was a moment of profound, calculated hypocrisy. Every single prince took that oath, knowing instantly that the moment they were beyond the walls of Constantinople and beyond the reach of the imperial guard, the promise would dissolve into the desert air like mist. They accepted the gifts, they took the supplies, they made the pledge, and they carried the deception in their hearts. The stage was now set, the armies amassed, the Bosphorus crossing imminent. They had successfully navigated the political minefield of the Byzantines, now prepared to face the true inferno. The great siege of the East, the trial by fire and iron that would define the next century, was about to begin, as they marched straight into the heart of the Islamic world, where death was waiting for them on every horizon. The journey east was not just across mountains and rivers. It was a collision course with the most powerful Christian empire left standing, Byzantium. When the disorganized, starving, yet fiercely zealous masses finally reached the colossal triple walls of Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos did not see saviors. He saw a tidal wave of barbarians ready to loot his city and shatter his fragile peace. His solution was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely political. He demanded an oath, a terrifying, legally binding promise that every piece of land recaptured from the Seljuks that had ever belonged to the Roman Empire would be immediately handed over to him. This was the price of passage, the cost of his logistical support, and a geopolitical power play of the highest order. The Western lords balked, feeling the knife twist in their backs before they even faced the Saracens. They had crossed a continent, enduring starvation and death, only to be asked to surrender their potential kingdoms before they even drew blood. The conflict of wills nearly tore the alliance apart within sight of the Holy Land's staging ground.
Godfrey of Bouillon, the steady, religious figurehead, eventually swore the oath, recognizing the need for Byzantine aid. But the true drama lay with Bohemond of Taranto, the cunning Norman prince who had spent his adult life dreaming of conquering Byzantine lands. He played the long game, swearing allegiance with a smile that hid a dagger, his eyes burning with ambition that went far beyond mere pilgrimage.
Alexios, realizing this army was too vast, too fanatical, and too dangerous to keep bottled up near his capital, hurried them across the Bosphorus. He supplied them, provisioned them grudgingly, but his ultimate goal was to rid himself of the ravenous, unpredictable Europeans before they devoured Constantinople whole. They marched into the unforgiving territory of Anatolia, the vast, arid heartland of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. This land was not a highway. It was a furnace, a desolate stretch where water was scarce, the heat was suffocating, and every shadow held a mounted archer ready to unleash a storm of arrows. The air hung thick with a warning. They immediately found the remnants of the People's Crusade, Peter the Hermit's tragic, premature army, scattered like bleached bones across the plains outside Civitate. These were not glorious martyrs. They were a horror story, left as a gruesome monument to the cost of unprepared faith, and a chilling reminder of the enemy's efficiency. The stench of death was a prelude to their first true objective, Nicaea. This was no minor fortress. Nicaea was a magnificent, heavily fortified city, strategically placed right on a vast lake, serving as the capital and pulsing heartbeat of Sultan Kilij Arslan I. This was not a skirmish. This was a confrontation with centralized, professional Islamic power, and the Crusaders knew failure here meant annihilation. Sultan Kilij Arslan I, supremely confident in his city's defenses, was away fighting a rival emir in the east, certain that his impregnable walls would hold any European rabble at bay for months. He was about to learn the terrible truth. The Crusaders, though starving and diseased, were driven by a fanaticism that defied military logic and an unprecedented military scale. They arrived and encircled the colossal 12-foot-thick walls in May 1097, the combined armies swelling to nearly 60,000 fighting men, plus their immense trail of non-combatants. The siege began with relentless, grinding brutality. The Crusaders faced a constant barrage of sorties, forced to fight not only the well-supplied defenders, but the scorching, dehydrating sun and the gnawing hunger that had followed them across the continent. They built massive siege towers and prepared for the final, bloody assault, tightening the noose around the city's throat. Then the hammer fell. Kilij Arslan, alerted to the unbelievable scale and speed of the Latin invasion, abandoned his eastern campaigns and rode like the wind, arriving with thousands of elite Turkish cavalry, intending to smash the siege lines and save his capital in a single devastating blow. What followed outside Nicaea's walls was pure, screaming carnage. The Crusaders, led by the ferocious Raymond of St. Gilles and the cunning Norman contingent, deployed their heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry into a brutal defensive line
designed to absorb the terrifying speed and arrow storms of the Turks. The clash was deafening. The air screamed with the sound of thousands of arrows raining down death, followed by the earth-shattering impact of steel-clad knights slamming into the light, swift Turkish riders. But the final act of the siege was stolen, a move that would forever cement the deep, corrosive mistrust between the East and West. As the Crusaders prepared for the final, bloody, climactic assault, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios, watching from afar and desperate to reclaim the city without the damage a Latin sacking would entail, sent secret envoys into the city. He negotiated a surrender directly with the Turkish defenders, promising them safety and clemency from the Latin butchers outside the walls. The Crusaders, weary but triumphant, woke one morning to see not their banners flying, but the golden standard of Byzantium raised high above the ramparts. Their prize was snatched away. Fury erupted among the crusading host. They had fought and bled for weeks, only to have their victory and the spoils of war stolen by their supposed Christian ally. Alexios attempted to mollify them with lavish gifts of gold and silver and promises of fair distribution, but the seed of betrayal was planted deep, twisting their motives and hardening their hearts against Constantinople. With Nicaea secured for the emperor, the vast army, now poorer, hungrier, and far angrier than before, prepared to march directly into the vast, unknown, hostile wasteland of central Anatolia, where Kilij Arslan was waiting, patient and bitter, ready to unleash the true, horrifying fury of the East. The road to Jerusalem was now open, paved only with the agonizing certainty of death and the promise of ultimate glory. The gates of Nicaea slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate not just against the soldiers of the Sultan, but against the very earth itself. The Crusaders, momentarily drunk on the success of their first major siege, believed God's hand was upon them. They did not realize that God's furnace was waiting, ready to incinerate their hubris in the desolate plains of Anatolia. This was not a victorious march. It was a slow, grueling dissection of the Holy Army by the sun, the stone, and the crippling scarcity of water. The immense column, bloated with temporary confidence and too many non-combatants, stretched for miles across the scorched terrain, an irresistible target waiting to be ambushed. Their logistical nightmare forced a fatal error. They split the unwieldy force into two massive bodies, an act of desperate foraging driven by the impossible need to sustain nearly 100,000 souls in a hostile wilderness. Bohemond of Taranto, with his fierce Norman contingent, and Robert Curthose, led the vanguard, unknowingly walking straight into the meticulously laid trap of the enemy. Kilij Arslan, the humiliated sultan who had lost his capital Nicaea, was not retreating, he was stalking. He had gathered his main forces, bitter and vengeful, and he knew these lands intimately. He intended to repay the Crusaders' temporary triumph, not in treaties or ransom, but in blood, soaking the dust of his homeland with European gore. June 30th, 1097, near the desolate fields of Dorylaeum. The air was heavy, not just with the unbearable heat, but with the ominous silence that precedes total devastation. Suddenly, the horizon dissolved into a terrifying cloud of dust, and from that inferno burst forth the nightmare machine of the Seljuk heavy cavalry. Thousands upon thousands of swift horsemen, a swirling, terrifying tide of disciplined motion. Their composite bows drawn taut, a sophisticated weapon system the clumsy, heavy-armored Europeans had no immediate answer for in open terrain. The onslaught was instant and absolute. The Seljuks did not charge to meet the shield wall in the slow, ceremonial manner of European knights. They flowed around it, a liquid torrent of destruction, firing volleys so thick they literally darkened the blistering mid-morning sun. They were drowning in arrows. They could not reach the enemy. The Turks would fire, wheel away using the deadly Parthian shot, reload at a full, impossibly fast gallop, and return, relentless and untouchable, chipping away at the rigid European formation. The Seljuks, sensing the final, inevitable victory, pressed closer, their war cries ringing with the promise of utter extermination, their arrows finally breaching the exhausted defenses. Just as the defensive circle began to buckle, just as the will of the remaining knights started to shatter under the weight of the massacre, a distant, magnificent sound broke through the din, the seismic, thundering hooves of heavy European cavalry, driven by the desperate loyalty of their brothers. Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of St. Gilles, having ridden their horses into the ground, arrived like avenging demigods, smashing into the flanks of the unsuspecting Seljuk army from the north and west. It was not just the arrival, it was the sheer overwhelming force of the disciplined charge, the concentrated weight of the Frankish iron against the light, fast-moving Turks. The two Crusader divisions, miraculously coordinated in the chaos and fury, crushed the Seljuk pincers and turned the battle on a knife edge. Kilij Arslan, who believed he had trapped his prey for total annihilation, suddenly found his forces surrounded, and his tactical advantage nullified by the sheer, blunt force of the Christian response. He was forced to order a strategic, bitter retreat, leaving behind thousands of dead and the entire contents of his massive camp. Doria-Lam was not a clean victory. It was a brutal, defining, and terrifying moment. The Crusaders had survived the ambush through a miracle of timing and sheer willpower, but the true, terrifying horror of the East had been laid bare before them. They had suffered thousands of casualties, lost nearly all their baggage train, and learned the crippling lesson. The enemy here was not a predictable feudal lord to be jousted. It was a phantom of arrows and fury that could disappear as quickly as it materialized, poisoning the land behind it. The victory opened the road, but at an astronomical, debilitating cost. The path ahead, across the remaining breadth of Anatolia, became a living hell. Kilij Arslan, defeated, but far from destroyed, adopted a scorched earth policy of pure malice, poisoning wells, burning every crop, and leaving nothing but dust, bones, and the sun-baked stones for the invaders. The subsequent 3-month march became an odyssey of absolute starvation, crippling thirst, and psychological torture. They ate their reserve horses, then their dogs, and finally they resorted to chewing on dried leather, roots, and the foulest swamp water they could find. Knights who had scorned hunger in the safety of Europe wept openly for a single handful of spoiled grain. The land itself became a relentless, silent foe, stripping them of their possessions and their humanity, leaving only the feverish, fanatical determination to reach the shining, impossible promise of Jerusalem, no matter the price paid in suffering. They were now truly isolated, fanatics marching into the utter unknown, fueled by the memory of Nicaea, the terror of Dorylaeum, and the ultimate, desperate need to survive, heading straight toward the ancient, jewel-encrusted, but hostile cities of the Levant. They had survived the hell of Anatolia, but the land of the Saracens offered no respite. Taurus mountains loomed like the jagged teeth of a hungry god, claiming more lives through sheer exhaustion and exposure than any Turkish arrow ever could. The great host, now a mere skeleton of the million-man frenzy that had left the banks of the Rhine, was starving, their armor rusted with the sweat of despair, their faces gaunt with the hollow promise of salvation. This was not a march. It was a slow, agonizing pilgrimage into the heart of the inferno, where every dry riverbed hid an ambush, and every abandoned village was a trap set by the merciless terrain itself. The unity forged in the heat of battle at Dorylaeum was beginning to crack under the weight of utter, continuous misery, paving the way for the ultimate betrayal. And in this moment of collective weakness, the true, naked ambition of men was revealed. Power, greed, and the pursuit of earthly crowns began to eclipse the heavenly mandate of the cross. Enter Baldwin of Boulogne, the lesser brother of Godfrey, a man whose ambition burned hotter than the sun over the Syrian desert, a man who saw not a holy war, but a land grab of unimaginable, eternal scale. His target, the legendary city of Edessa, far to the northeast, an isolated beacon of wealth and grain, held precariously by an Armenian prince named Thoros. Baldwin didn't need to conquer Edessa. He merely needed to manipulate and inherit it. A process that proved chillingly swift and brutally pragmatic, setting the template for every future Crusader warlord. Thoros, desperate and facing internal dissent from his own Armenian subjects, who feared the coming Turkish storm far more than the Frankish invaders, welcomed the strong, iron fist of the Western warlord. He adopted Baldwin as his son, sealing the precarious political alliance with a grand feast and a temporary, fragile peace, believing he had bought his survival. But in the cutthroat politics of survival, blood ties meant absolutely nothing when real power was on the table. Within days, the highly volatile citizens of Edessa, encouraged or perhaps coerced by Baldwin's sudden intimidating presence and his promise of stability, rose up in a terrifying spasm of internal, bloody violence. Thoros was overthrown, dragged through the streets, and brutally murdered as the Frankish troops watched in cold silence. Baldwin of Boulogne, standing atop the blood-soaked walls, had done what no crusader had yet achieved through pure military might. He had founded the very first Frankish state in the Middle East. The county of Edessa was born, a dangerous, isolated bastion of European power, secured entirely by ambition and cemented by calculated political assassination, fundamentally altering the nature of the entire enterprise. The religious fever dream had become a colonial expansion. Meanwhile, the main force, Godfrey, Bohemond, Raymond of Toulouse, arrived before the sheer, terrifying walls of Antioch, oblivious to Baldwin's stunning betrayal, their attention consumed by the sheer, staggering impossibility of the task ahead. Antioch was not merely a fortress, it was a nightmare rendered in stone, defying gravity and engineering. This was not some hastily fortified hamlet or an open-field battle to be decided by cavalry charges. This was one of the most heavily defended cities in the known world. Its walls, built by the Romans and reinforced across a millennium by Byzantine engineers, rose up the sheer slopes of Mount Silpius, a terrifying labyrinth of towers, deep ditches, and massive, unyielding gates. Its defenders were led by the formidable Emir Yagi Sian, a man known for his unflinching resolve, his absolute discipline, and his deep, venomous hatred for the encroaching Franks. He knew the strategic value of this city better than anyone. If Antioch fell, the entire northern gateway to the Holy Land was irrevocably blown open, and the path to Jerusalem was clear for the fanatical barbarians. Yagi Sion was ready for them. He had ruthlessly expelled the majority of the Greek Orthodox Christians, those he rightfully distrusted, and had stockpiled enough provisions to outlast a decade-long siege. He watched the approaching Crusader army, stretched thin and exhausted, and smiled from his battlements, certain that the Syrian winter and starvation would do his lethal work for him, consuming the invaders whole. The Crusaders arrived in late October 1097, facing the onset of the wet, miserable season. The initial shock was utterly palpable. They had been promised rich, easily conquered cities by Alexios I. They found an invincible fortress that mocked their every effort. The army, perhaps 30,000 fighting men strong at this point, could not possibly encircle the colossal circumference of the walls, leaving massive sections, particularly the vital southern gates, completely unguarded. Bohemond of Taranto, ever the military pragmatist and easily the most gifted strategic mind among the warring princes, immediately grasped the grim reality. This would not be a quick siege decided by a single bloody assault. This would be a desperate, soul-crushing war of attrition, fought not just against the Turkish defenders, but against the brutal Syrian winter that was already beginning to bite with chilling, murderous ferocity. The great siege began.
The Franks camped on the northern side, near the gate of St. Paul, facing the Orontes River. But their disastrous inability to fully blockade the city meant that vital supplies, necessary reinforcements, and crucial intelligence continued to flow unimpeded to Yagi Sion through the undefended southern gates and across the treacherous terrain of Mount Silpius. It became a deadly waiting game, a slow, agonizing grind. Weeks turned into months. The initial religious fervor evaporated under the endless rain and cold, replaced by the bitter cold and the gnawing, paralyzing hunger. The provisions they had carried from Byzantine lands were consumed rapidly, and the surrounding countryside was stripped bare by increasingly desperate, often murderous foraging parties. The Crusaders, who had come on a divine mission to liberate the Holy Land, were now themselves prisoners of the colossal stone monster they intended to slay. They were starving, freezing, and facing constant, terrifying, highly disciplined sorties from the Turkish defenders who knew the terrain intimately and struck with brutal efficiency. The siege of Antioch was not merely a military operation. It was a deep, existential descent into medieval horror, where the thin line between savior and savage dissolved completely under the strain of absolute deprivation. The true final test of the entire crusade had just begun, and the world held its breath, waiting to see if these ragged zealots would find salvation or merely their mass grave beneath those towering, unforgiving walls. The walls of Antioch. They were not merely fortifications. They were the terrifying, final testament to Roman strength and Islamic mastery. A barrier of sheer, unyielding stone that mocked the desperate faith of the arriving crusaders. This was not Nicaea, vulnerable to trickery and swift assault. Antioch was the prize, the colossal jewel, defended by nearly 20 miles of towering battlements, bristling with 400 watchtowers that seemed to glare down at the Christian camp with ancient, cold malice. The sheer scale of the defense was paralyzing. Under the command of Governor Yagi Sion, a hardened, astute military leader, the city was prepared for a siege that could last years. The moment the main body of the Crusader host arrived in October 1097, the euphoria of survival evaporated, replaced by a cold, dreadful certainty. They had encountered an obstacle that might actually be unbreakable. Initial reconnaissance revealed the horrific truth. To surround the city completely was impossible. The army was simply too thin, too exhausted, and too poorly supplied. The sheer circumference demanded a logistical miracle they could not provide. They settled for investing only the crucial northern and western gates, leaving the eastern and southern flanks partially open, a desperate gamble that Yagi Sion was shrewd enough to exploit, allowing limited resupply to trickle in. Then came the winter. It was not just cold. It was a relentless, soul-crushing torrent of rain and mud that turned the Crusader camp, already a cesspool of disease, into a literal swamp of despair. The spiritual fever that had fueled their march began to break,
replaced by the shivering misery of famine and dysentery. The logistical nightmare became absolute terror. They had stripped the surrounding countryside clean months ago. Now horses were dying by the hundreds, their flesh becoming the last pitiful scraps for the starving troops. The knights, the very backbone of the army, were forced to walk, their armor rusting, their faces gaunt, realizing with sickening clarity that they were trapped. The price of faith was turning into a prolonged, agonizing death. Desertion, once unthinkable, became commonplace. Men who had survived the horrors of Anatolia slipped away under the cover of the constant rain, heading back toward the supposed safety of Constantinople, preferring the wrath of the emperor to the slow, muddy grave outside Antioch. The great princes, Godfrey, Raymond, and especially Bohemond, whose keen eye saw every crack in the military machine, struggled violently to maintain control. They knew lifting the siege meant the absolute end of the crusade and eternal damnation in the eyes of the West. They had to hold, even if it meant cannibalizing their own supplies and sacrificing their troops to starvation. Bohemond, the cunning Norman, understood that the siege could only be won by attrition and control of the external supply lines. He orchestrated a devastating, brutal raid to secure the crucial iron bridge, Jisr al-Hadid, to the east, a vital artery for the city's supplies and the expected Turkish reinforcements. It was a vicious, necessary bloodletting that bought them temporary, fragile control over the immediate environment. This siege was not a battle of heroes. It was a test of the soul's endurance against the most squalid conditions imaginable. The spiritual fire was banked under layers of mud and filth. Priests reported finding hidden caches of grain among the wealthy nobles, sparking fury and near mutiny among the foot soldiers, who were reduced to eating roots, grass, and boiled leather. The internal rot threatened to destroy the army faster than the arrows from the ramparts. The princes, recognizing the imminent collapse of morale, were forced to stage desperate, highly visible religious ceremonies, fasting, processions, public confessions, to try and rekindle the dying fanaticism that had brought them this far. They needed a miracle, or at least a monumental victory, to snap the army back into fighting shape. And as the winter finally started to recede, a terrifying new factor entered the equation. The outside world had heard of the Crusaders' plight, and the great Seljuk emirs were mobilizing. Antioch was a fortress, but the Crusaders were about to find themselves besieged by a massive relief force from Mosul, commanded by the fearsome Kerboga. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The entire exhausted, starving army, clinging desperately to the muddy ground outside the unconquered iron walls, was now forced to turn its gaze eastward, knowing that a new, infinitely more dangerous enemy was marching swiftly toward them. The siege of Antioch had just escalated from a test of endurance to a fight for total, horrifying annihilation. Caught between the impenetrable walls of the city and the roaring tide of the Islamic world coming to crush them. The walls of Antioch had become a suffocating, lethal cage for the faithful. Starvation had chewed through the ranks, turning hardened knights into skeletal shadows, haunted by the smell of burning refuse and the constant, mocking silence from the citadel high above them. They were eating their boots, boiling the saddles, praying for death, just to end the gnawing emptiness that had replaced their holy purpose. Desertion was rampant, a trickle that became a flood, with great leaders like Stephen of Blois abandoning the cause, claiming the entire venture was cursed and utterly hopeless, fleeing back toward Constantinople and spreading the poisonous rumor of inevitable defeat. The Crusader army, now technically inside the conquered city of Antioch, but still completely surrounded by the citadel and the new, massive relief force outside, was trapped in a hellish paradox. They had won the battle, only to lose the war in the very next heartbeat, facing a doom far greater than the siege itself. The Crusaders were dying at a rate that dwarfed the previous battles, not by sword, but by the slow, agonizing cruelty of hunger and typhoid, turning the liberated city into a charnel house where the living envied the dead. Then the true nightmare materialized, darkening the entire horizon. The sky, once empty save for the scattered campfires of the beleaguered Franks, suddenly vanished beneath the dust cloud of an army so enormous, so disciplined, that it made the previous Seljuk forces look like a scattered raiding party. This was Kerbuga, the Atabeg of Mosul, leading a unified Turkish-Arab juggernaut mobilized by the Sultan, specifically designed to wipe the Western invaders from the face of the Levant forever. He arrived with terrifying speed, immediately sealing the Crusaders inside Antioch, reversing the roles of the besieged and the besieger with brutal efficiency, trapping them between the hostile citadel holding out in the south and his endless lines of horse archers outside the city walls. This was the combined might of the Islamic world, finally unified and determined to crush the infestation. Bohemond, Godfrey, and Raymond of Toulouse looked upon the crushing numerical superiority and knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that their final moment was at hand, that this was not a skirmish, but the final judgment for their entire world. Every path out was sealed, and the larder was empty. Fear became fanaticism, and fanaticism quickly spiraled into outright madness. The men were starving. They were outnumbered 20-1, and every single prayer felt like it was hitting a ceiling of solid brass, deaf to their pleas from a distant, uncaring heaven. It was in this abyss of hopelessness that the whispers started, carried by the starving wind inside the battered city walls. Whispers of a divine intervention, a hidden secret waiting beneath the floorboards of an ancient church. A final, desperate gamble for salvation. Enter Peter Bartholomew, a peasant pilgrim and visionary who claimed to have received a series of terrifying, vivid dreams from St. Andrew himself. These weren't subtle messages. These were thunderbolts of instruction, pointing directly to the hidden location of one of the most sacred relics in all of Christendom, the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross, hidden centuries ago for safekeeping. Bartholomew swore to the skeptical, cynical leaders, especially the pragmatic Norman Bohemond, that this lance was buried deep beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter within the city, and that its discovery would be the single divine sign required to turn their impending annihilation into the glorious, unstoppable victory promised by God. The nobles were suspicious. They were disgusted. This sounded like the desperate ravings of a starving man, a dangerous illusion designed to ignite false hope. Yet their desperation was such that they couldn't afford to ignore even the faintest glimmer of hope, no matter how outlandish or impossible the claim, because the alternative was certain death and the complete failure of the mission. The skeptical Bohemond and Godfrey waited outside, ready to denounce the peasant as a fraud and execute him the moment the digging proved futile, ready to face the inevitable surrender that failure would necessitate. Then, after endless hours of fruitless labor, just as the sun was setting and the air was thick with disappointment, the clang of metal against stone resonated through the earth, a sound that shook the foundations of the crusade itself. Peter Bartholomew himself leaped into the pit, and after frantic scraping pulled forth a rusted, unremarkable piece of iron, the Holy Lance, they claimed, brought forth from the very soil of Antioch, an undeniable miracle bestowed upon the suffering army, a direct communication from God himself. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't just a relic. It was the physical manifestation of God choosing them over death, a tangible connection to the power of the divine. The starved men who moments before had been ready to surrender were now imbued with a terrifying, supernatural confidence, their bodies running on pure, unadulterated zealotry. The fear vanished, replaced by an ecstatic, murderous fervor. They immediately scheduled the counterattack, ignoring the fact that Kerboga's army was still monstrously larger, better equipped, and infinitely better fed. The strategic situation was still impossible. The psychological shift was everything, turning a broken army into a spiritual weapon. They would march out, not as desperate refugees, but as the instruments of divine will, holding aloft the spear that had spilled the blood of God himself, prepared to die, but more importantly, prepared to kill. On June 28th, 1098, the army, now split into 6 small battle divisions led by the major princes, prepared for the ultimate gamble. They could not remain trapped inside the city any longer. Starvation would accomplish what Kerboga's swords could not, forcing them into a desperate, all-or-nothing engagement. They opened the iron gate, the only exit not completely blocked by the Turkish siege lines, and streamed forth. Peter the Hermit, who had seen his people's crusade obliterated, now marched at the head, carrying the Holy Lance, flanked by priests chanting ancient, terrible hymns of war and sacrifice. This was not a military maneuver. It was a religious exorcism, a suicide charge dressed up as a divine mandate. The fate of the entire crusade, the fate of Christendom in the East, rested on the terrifying gamble that a piece of rusted iron was stronger than 100,000 Turkish swords and the unified might of the Islamic world, roaring for their extermination. The gamble was terrifying, and the house always wins. The victorious, blood-soaked charge at Dorylaeum had bought the Crusaders one thing: the terrifying opportunity to march directly into the abyss. They moved from the brief, glorious battlefield of fire and steel into a literal, scorching oven, where the very sun was their ultimate, relentless enemy. The vast Anatolian landscape, stretching like the dried, cracked skin of a forgotten giant, consumed them whole. Their armor became instruments of torture, heating the flesh beneath, and the lack of water turned their very blood into thick, sluggish syrup, barely able to sustain life. This was no longer a noble march for the faith. It was a slow, agonizing funeral procession across the face of a dying continent. Every day, the invisible enemy claimed its victims: thirst, dysentery, and the gnawing terror of perpetual hunger that hollowed out the souls of even the fiercest knights. The rumors began to circulate. Dark whispers passed around dying campfires, whispers of men driven so insane by starvation that they turned their eyes on the weakest among them, a horrifying truth that the chroniclers dared not fully write down. The line between salvation and utter savagery had vanished. But even this march of the damned had an objective, a final intimidating destination that promised either glorious victory or total annihilation. Antioch, the gateway to the Holy Land, the jewel of the Orient, the fortress designed not by mortal men, but by the very gods of war themselves. For centuries, its impossibly high walls had stood defiant, 400 colossal towers rising from the stone, protecting a city so sprawling, so vast, that the remaining 100,000 crusaders couldn't even dream of fully encircling it. It was the ultimate medieval stronghold, a city that scoffed at siege engines. When the ragged, skeletal army finally crested the ridge and saw the intimidating shadow of Antioch spread out before them, a chilling, soul-crushing realization swept through the ranks. They were too few, too starved, and impossibly late. The city was impenetrable, and the siege they were about to begin was a guaranteed recipe for their extermination. They settled into a slow, grinding siege that was doomed from the very first day. The lack of supplies was instant and catastrophic. Bohemond, the cunning Norman, pushed deep into the surrounding enemy countryside, often returning with nothing but blood, corpses, and empty promises, the land itself having been scoured clean. The weather turned against them with biblical vengeance. The autumn rains came, turning the camp into a sea of viscous, disease-ridden mud. Then winter descended upon them like a freezing, suffocating shroud, a relentless cold they were utterly unprepared to face after the desert crossing. The knights, the nobility of Europe, the proudest warriors of the West, were reduced to miserable, shivering infantry, their status dissolving into the freezing mud. Their armor, once a symbol of prestige, now felt like a cage of ice. The famine reached catastrophic levels. Men stopped praying for victory and started praying for death, just to end the cold, agonizing emptiness in their stomachs. The princes, starved and furious, began turning on each other, their bitter rivalries boiling over the empty cooking pots. Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond fought openly, not over tactics, but over who would claim ownership of Antioch if they ever somehow managed to breach its walls. The common soldiers saw the sickening hypocrisy, their leaders arguing over territory while they ate roots and boiled leather. The most devastating blow, however, came not from the impenetrable walls of Antioch, but from within the ranks of the supposed leaders. Stephen of Blois, a man who had sworn the most sacred oath to God in Clermont, finally broke. He was a brilliant letter writer, a man of refined tastes, but a spectacular failure as a true warrior. He looked at the endless frozen siege, the dying men, and the insurmountable walls, and his aristocratic resolve finally crumbled into dust and despair. Convinced the entire Christian enterprise was a hopeless catastrophe ordained for destruction, he made the decision that would forever stain his name. He deserted. He packed his bags, took his remaining retinue, and fled back toward the relative safety of Constantinople.
His departure was not just the loss of troops. It was a devastating dagger plunged into the heart of morale. It signaled to the entire watching world that the great Christian crusade was failing, and the leaders themselves were abandoning the cause to die in the frozen ditch.
This act of calculated cowardice had immediate, terrifying consequences. On his flight, Stephen encountered the massive Sultanic Relief Army, an unprecedented Islamic force led by the legendary commander Kerboga, roaring toward Antioch to wipe the Crusaders off the map. Stephen of Blois, seeing his chance to justify his desertion, lied to Kerboga, claiming the Crusaders were already defeated, decimated, and on the verge of total collapse. This monumental lie bought Kerboga time, making him slow his approach, believing the starving invaders were no longer a threat. It was the greatest military mistake Kerboga would ever make, but at the time, it looked like the final bitter end for the Crusaders. They were caught between the immovable city and the unstoppable Islamic army barreling down on them. But even in this darkest hour, a flicker of wicked, desperate opportunity emerged. The walls of Antioch were strong, yes, but its defense ultimately relied on men. Men who, like the Crusaders, were susceptible to gold and fear and the corrosive power of betrayal. Bohemond, the ultimate pragmatist, understood that a direct assault could not succeed. Only treachery could breach the impregnable city. He began to search methodically for the weakness, the single human flaw in Antioch's mighty armor. And he found him. He found a man named Firuz, an Armenian renegade who had converted to Islam, and now guarded 3 of the colossal towers along the wall. Firuz hated his current masters, the Turkish emir Yagisiyan, and Bohemond discovered that this hatred ran deeper than his current loyalties. The negotiation was swift, silent, and deadly. Gold was exchanged, and a secret, terrifying plan was whispered into the night wind, a guaranteed path to open the gates, not through force, but through calculated, cold-blooded betrayal. The fate of the entire First Crusade, the fate of Jerusalem itself, the fate of a generation of Europeans, now hinged entirely on the greed of one renegade guard and the treacherous, desperate resolve of Bohemond of Toronto.